At 30,000 feet above the ground, where the world below looks peaceful and distant, something unexpected was quietly taking shape, something no one on that flight would ever forget. The first-class cabin was calm and luxurious. Soft lighting filled the space, the gentle hum of the engines created a soothing background sound, and passengers were settling into their wide, comfortable seats. Some were sipping freshly served drinks, others scrolling through their phones, and a few were already drifting off to sleep. Among them sat Keanu Reeves. But if you didn't know who he was, you'd never guess it. He didn't look like a typical celebrity. No designer suit, no expensive accessories, no bodyguards hovering nearby. Instead, he wore a slightly worn brown jacket, a plain t-shirt, faded jeans, and simple boots. His hair was slightly messy, and his beard gave him a rugged, almost tired look. He looked more like a quiet traveler than a world-famous actor. And that's exactly how everyone treated him, like he didn't belong. Keanu sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of clouds outside. There was a calmness about him, a kind of peaceful silence that made him almost invisible in a cabin full of loud personalities and confident energy. A few rows ahead, a group of businessmen had just boarded earlier. They were sharply dressed in expensive suits, their watches shining under the cabin lights. They spoke loudly, laughed confidently, and carried themselves with the kind of attitude that demanded attention. It didn't take long for one of them to notice Keanu. He leaned slightly toward his colleague, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep it private. "Hey," he muttered with a smirk, nodding toward Keanu, "take a look at that guy." The others followed his gaze. For a moment, they simply observed him, his clothes, his posture, his quiet demeanor. Then came the judgment. "Seriously," another man whispered, raising an eyebrow. "How did he end up here?" A third man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Looks like someone got lucky, or slipped through the system." Their smirks grew wider, their confidence feeding off each other. Finally, one of them leaned back in his seat and spoke louder this time, making sure the comment traveled far enough. "Looks like someone snuck into the wrong section." A few nearby passengers turned their heads, instantly sensing the shift in atmosphere. Conversations paused. Eyes quietly moved between the businessmen and the man they were mocking. But Keanu didn't react. Not even a glance. He remained still, his eyes still fixed outside the window, as if he hadn't heard a single word. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, no frustration, just calmness. That silence only seemed to encourage them. Another businessman laughed under his breath and added, "Yeah, maybe he thinks this is economy plus." A couple of them laughed quietly, clearly entertained by their own jokes. One woman sitting nearby looked uncomfortable. She glanced at Keanu, then back at the men, unsure whether to say something or stay silent. Like many others, she chose silence. The tension in the air slowly grew heavier. The flight attendants continued their service, politely offering drinks and snacks, but even they seemed to notice the subtle shift in mood. One of them briefly glanced at Keanu, almost as if checking whether he was okay. But he didn't need checking. He was completely unbothered. Instead of reacting, he slowly leaned back into his seat, folded his hands, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if he had chosen peace over conflict. That choice confused the men even more. Most people would have responded. Most would have defended themselves, argued back, or at least shown some kind of reaction. But not him. His silence wasn't weakness. It was something deeper. Something they didn't understand. And that made them underestimate him even more. "Unbelievable," one of the men muttered, shaking his head. "Some people really don't know their place." The words hung in the air. A quiet insult, heavy with arrogance. Yet still, no response. The engines continued their steady hum. The plane moved forward through the sky, but inside that cabin, something else was moving too, a story that was slowly building, moment by moment. A story of judgment. A story of humility. And a lesson that was about to hit harder than anyone expected. Because what those men didn't realize was that the quiet man they were mocking wasn't just another passenger. He was someone the world admired. Someone respected not just for his success, but for his character. And very soon, the truth would change everything. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, the calm atmosphere of the first-class cabin slowly began to shift. What had started as quiet whispers from the group of businessmen was now turning into something more open, more uncomfortable, and far more disrespectful. The men, clearly enjoying their own sense of superiority, leaned back in their seats with careless confidence. Their voices grew louder, no longer concerned about who might hear them. It was as if they had already decided who belonged in that space, and who didn't. One of them adjusted his expensive watch, glanced again toward Keanu Reeves, and smirked. Seriously, he muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "This is getting ridiculous." Then, without hesitation, he pressed the call button above his seat. A soft chime echoed, and within moments, a flight attendant approached with a polite smile. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" The man tilted his head slightly and gestured toward Keanu with a subtle but obvious point. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance, "are you sure he belongs here? This is first class." The question cut through the air. Nearby passengers went quiet again, their eyes shifting between the attendant and Keanu. Some looked down, pretending not to notice. Others watched carefully, sensing that things were crossing a line. The flight attendant remained calm and professional. She briefly glanced toward Keanu, who sat quietly by the window, then turned back to the man. "Yes, sir," she replied politely, "he does." Her answer was simple, clear, and respectful. But it wasn't enough. The man let out a small, disbelieving laugh and leaned back in his seat. "Really?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "Because he doesn't look like he can afford it." A few of his colleagues chuckled under their breath, clearly entertained. The words hung heavily in the cabin. This time, the discomfort was impossible to ignore. A woman sitting across the aisle shifted in her seat, visibly uneasy. Another passenger shook his head slightly, as if silently disagreeing but unwilling to get involved. The tension was building. All eyes slowly turned toward Keanu. Surely now, he would respond. Surely now, he would say something. But he didn't. Instead, Keanu calmly turned his head away from the window and looked at the flight attendant. His expression was soft, his eyes kind, completely untouched by the negativity around him. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he said gently. "Don't worry about it." His voice was calm, almost peaceful. For a moment, the flight attendant seemed surprised. She nodded slightly, appreciating his response, and gave him a grateful look before stepping away. But the businessmen? They found it amusing. "Wow," one of them said with a quiet laugh, leaning forward. "He's polite too." Another smirked and added, "Yeah, maybe he's someone's assistant." A few of them laughed again, their confidence growing stronger with every unchallenged comment. To them, his silence wasn't dignity, it was weakness. They mistook his calmness for insecurity. They assumed his kindness meant he didn't belong. And that assumption only fueled their behavior. Meanwhile, Keanu returned his gaze to the window, as if the entire situation had already passed for him. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, glowing softly under the sunlight. It was peaceful. Completely opposite of the tension building inside the cabin. He took a slow breath, relaxed into his seat, and folded his hands. No anger. No frustration. No need to prove anything. That quiet strength, however, went completely unnoticed by the men who continued their mockery. Unbelievable, one of them whispered, shaking his head. People really try anything these days. Another added, yeah, I mean, first class used to mean something. Their words carried a deeper message. Not just about Keanu, but about how they viewed the world. To them, appearance defined value. Clothing defined status. And silence meant inferiority. But they were wrong. And deep down, a few passengers knew it. The woman across the aisle stole another glance at Keanu. There was something different about him, something calm, something grounded. He didn't seem out of place at all. If anything, he seemed like the only person truly at peace. Still, no one spoke up. The cabin remained divided, between those who judged, those who noticed, and the one man who simply chose not to react. Time passed, but the impact of those words lingered in the air. Because sometimes, silence says more than any argument ever could. And sometimes, the people who say the least, have the most powerful stories. Little did those men realize, they weren't just misjudging a passenger. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. No one spoke up. The cabin remained divided, between those who judged, those who noticed, and the one man who simply chose not to react. Time passed, but the impact of those words lingered in the air. Because sometimes, silence says more than any argument ever could. And sometimes, the people who say the least, have the most powerful stories. Little did those men realize, they weren't just misjudging a passenger. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Several hours had passed since the uncomfortable exchange earlier in the flight. The cabin lights were dimmed slightly, creating a calmer atmosphere as most passengers settled into their own quiet routines. Some were watching movies, others resting, and a few continued light conversations in hushed tones. But beneath that calm surface, the earlier tension still lingered, especially around the group of businessmen who had not completely let go of their judgment. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves remained exactly the same, quiet, composed, and completely unbothered. He had spent most of the time either looking out the window or sitting peacefully with his thoughts. There was no sign that the earlier insults had affected him at all. Then, in a single unexpected moment, everything changed. A young flight attendant began making her way down the aisle, carefully balancing a tray filled with drinks. Glasses of juice, soda, and water gently shaking with the movement of the plane. She looked focused, taking small, careful steps to avoid spilling anything. But as she reached the middle of the cabin, something went wrong. The plane hit a slight patch of turbulence. It wasn't strong, but it was enough. The tray tilted. Her grip slipped. And within a second, everything came crashing down. Glasses shattered against the floor. Liquid spilled across the aisle. The sharp sound of breaking glass cut through the quiet cabin, instantly drawing everyone's attention. The attendant froze. Her eyes widened in shock as she looked down at the mess. For a moment, she didn't move. Her face turned red with embarrassment, and her breathing became uneven. All eyes were on her. Passengers looked up from their seats, some surprised, some annoyed, some simply curious. A few whispered quietly to each other. The silence that followed felt heavy. For the young attendant, it must have felt overwhelming. And then, before anyone else could react, someone moved. It was Keanu. Without hesitation, he unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and stepped into the aisle. There was no frustration on his face, no irritation, just calm concern. "Hey," he said gently as he approached her, his voice soft and reassuring, "it's okay." He slowly knelt down beside her, carefully avoiding the broken glass. "Accidents happen." His tone was kind, steady, exactly what she needed in that moment. The attendant looked at him, clearly surprised. She hadn't expected anyone, especially a passenger, to step in so quickly. "Sir, you don't have to," she began, still flustered. "I know," he replied with a small, warm smile. "But I want to." And without another word, he began helping her. He carefully picked up the larger pieces of glass, placing them aside to make the area safer. He moved slowly and cautiously, making sure not to make the situation worse. Another flight attendant quickly rushed over with cleaning supplies, but even then, Keanu continued to assist without hesitation. What stood out wasn't just what he was doing, but how he was doing it. There was no rush, no impatience, no sign of annoyance. Instead, he treated the situation, and the person in front of him, with complete respect. "It's really okay," he said again quietly, noticing her embarrassment. "No one's hurt. That's what matters." The young attendant nodded, still processing everything. His calm presence seemed to steady her. Slowly, her nervous expression softened. "Thank you," she said quietly. Keanu simply nodded back. Once the area was but inside the cabin, everything had changed. The same passengers who had watched in silence earlier were now watching with a completely different perspective. The atmosphere felt different. Quieter. Heavier, but in a meaningful way. Even the businessmen who had been mocking him earlier sat still, their expressions no longer filled with amusement. Instead, there was confusion. They exchanged brief glances with each other, unsure of what to say. This wasn't what they expected. This wasn't how they thought someone like him would act. In their minds, they had already decided who he was, a man who didn't belong, someone beneath them. But the person they just witnessed? He didn't match that image at all. Not even close. For the first time since the flight began, their confidence seemed to weaken. They didn't laugh. They didn't make any comments. They simply watched. And somewhere deep down, something began to shift. Because sometimes, it's not loud words or big actions that change people's minds. Sometimes, it's a simple act of kindness, done quietly, without expecting anything in return, that speaks the loudest. And even though they still didn't know who he truly was, they were starting to realize one thing. They had judged him completely wrong. As the long flight slowly approached its final stage, the atmosphere inside the cabin began to shift once again. The soft glow of the cabin lights brightened slightly as the plane started its gradual descent. Outside the windows, the endless sea of clouds began to break, revealing glimpses of the world below. Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened their seatbelts, and prepared for landing. Some stretched after the long journey, while others checked their phones, waiting for signal to return. The quiet hum of the aircraft remained steady, but there was a subtle feeling that the journey wasn't quite over yet. Then, suddenly, click. The cabin speakers came to life. The captain's calm, professional voice echoed through the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed your flight with us today. We'll be landing shortly, so please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." A routine announcement. Nothing unusual. Passengers barely reacted, continuing their own activities. But then the captain paused, and continued. "And before we land, we would like to take a moment to give a special thanks to one of our passengers on board today." That line caught attention. A few heads lifted. Conversations slowed. People began listening more closely. A very special thanks to Mr. Keanu Reeves. For a split second. Silence. Complete silence. It was as if time itself had paused inside the cabin. Passengers froze mid-motion. A man holding his drink stopped halfway to his lips. Someone scrolling on their phone suddenly stopped. Eyes widened. Heads turned. "Keanu Reeves," someone whispered softly. The name echoed quietly from row to row. The captain's voice continued, now carrying a tone of appreciation. "Yes, the very same Keanu Reeves, who has not only blessed us with his presence but also quietly helped our crew during the flight. Sir, we truly appreciate your kindness and humility. Thank you for flying with us. And just like that, everything changed. The calm cabin instantly transformed into a wave of shock, curiosity, and disbelief. Passengers began whispering rapidly. Wait, seriously? That's him? No way, that's Keanu Reeves. Some gasped openly, their hands covering their mouths in surprise. Others leaned into the aisle, trying to get a better look at the man who had been sitting so quietly the entire time. A few passengers quickly reached for their phones, subtly trying to capture a picture, though many hesitated, sensing that he wasn't the kind of person who would appreciate attention. All eyes turned toward him. And there he was. Still sitting calmly by the window. Still quiet. Still exactly the same. No dramatic reaction. No acknowledgement of the announcement. No attempt to draw attention to himself. Just a simple, humble presence. As if none of it mattered. But for one group of people, everything mattered now. The businessmen. The same men who had been laughing, whispering, and judging him just hours earlier. Their faces changed instantly. The confidence they once carried disappeared. Their relaxed posture stiffened. The smirks that once filled their faces were completely gone. Replaced by something else. Shock. Wait, one of them whispered, his voice suddenly dry. That's Keanu Reeves? Another leaned forward, staring in disbelief. The movie star? The realization hit them all at once. The quiet man they had mocked. The one they had judged based on his appearance. The one they had questioned, insulted, and laughed at. Was not just any passenger. He was someone known around the world. Someone respected. Someone admired, not just for his success, but for his humility. And suddenly, their words from earlier replayed in their minds. He doesn't look like he can afford it. Maybe he's someone's assistant. Each sentence now felt heavier than before. Embarrassing. Painful. Regretful. One of the men slowly leaned back into his seat, running a hand through his hair. Another looked down, avoiding eye contact with anyone around him. The group that once seemed so confident now sat in complete silence. They didn't laugh. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Because now, they understood. And the worst part? It wasn't just that they had insulted a famous person. It was that they had completely misjudged a human being. Around them, the energy in the cabin continued to shift. Passengers now looked at Keanu with admiration, curiosity, even respect. Some smiled quietly, appreciating the kind gesture he had shown earlier. The same act of kindness they had witnessed before now held even deeper meaning. Because now they knew who he really was. But interestingly, that didn't change him at all. He remained the same person. Quiet. Humble. Unbothered by both the insults from before, and the attention now. And that, more than anything else, made the moment even more powerful. Because while others changed the way they saw him, he never changed the way he was. For the businessmen, however, the realization was overwhelming. Their laughter had turned into silence. Their confidence had turned into discomfort. And in its place, there was only one thing left. Regret. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels meeting the runway with a soft but steady impact. A gentle round of relief moved through the cabin as the long journey finally came to an end. The engines slowed, and within moments, the aircraft began taxiing toward the terminal. But inside the plane, something far more important had already arrived, a shift in perspective. The seatbelt signs turned off with a soft chime. Passengers began to gather their belongings, standing up, stretching, and preparing to leave. Overhead compartments opened, bags were pulled down, and quiet conversations filled the air again. Yet, despite all the usual movement, there was a noticeable difference in the atmosphere. It felt heavier. More thoughtful. Because everyone knew what had just happened. And more importantly, what it meant. Sitting quietly by the window was still Keanu Reeves, unchanged from the moment he boarded. While others rushed to grab their luggage or check their phones, he remained seated for a few extra seconds, calm and unhurried. He didn't push forward. He didn't seek attention. He simply waited. Meanwhile, a few rows ahead, the businessmen who had spent most of the flight mocking him stood in complete silence. The confidence they once carried had completely disappeared. Their movements were slower now, more uncertain. Their eyes occasionally glanced toward Keanu, but quickly looked away again. They were thinking. Replaying everything. Every comment. Every laugh. Every moment they had judged him without knowing a single thing about him. One of them adjusted his tie nervously. Another let out a quiet sigh, as if trying to gather the courage to do something he knew he couldn't avoid. Finally, as the line of passengers slowly began moving toward the exit, they found themselves standing just a few steps away from him. This was the moment. The space between them felt smaller than ever. But heavier than before. One of the men swallowed hard, then took a small step forward. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice no longer confident, but hesitant and sincere. Keanu looked up at him. His expression was calm. No anger. No judgment. Just quiet attention. The man continued, struggling slightly to find the right words. We didn't realize it was you," he admitted. "We're really sorry." The others stood behind him, nodding quietly in agreement. Their earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by genuine regret. For a brief moment, there was silence. Everyone nearby seemed to pause, subtly listening. Keanu held their gaze, not in a confrontational way, but in a calm, understanding manner. Then he gave a small, gentle nod. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't need to apologize to me." The men looked slightly relieved, as if a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. But before they could fully relax, he continued. "Just remember something," he added, his voice still calm but now carrying quiet meaning. They listened closely. "You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on how they look." He paused for a brief second. "Whether they're famous or not." Silence. Complete silence. Those words didn't come with anger. They didn't come with accusation. But somehow, they hit deeper than any harsh response ever could. The men stood still, absorbing every word. Because they knew, he was right. It wasn't about who he was. It was about who they had been. And that realization stayed with them. One of the men slowly nodded, unable to speak. Another looked down, clearly reflecting on his actions. There was no defense left, no excuse, only understanding. Around them, a few passengers quietly observed the moment. Some smiled softly, appreciating the grace with which Keanu handled the situation. Others simply walked past, carrying that lesson with them in silence. And then, just like that, the moment passed. Keanu picked up his small bag, stepped into the aisle, and began walking toward the exit. No rush. No drama. No need to prove anything. As he reached the door of the plane, a flight attendant gave him a warm, grateful smile. He returned it with a simple nod and quietly stepped off. He didn't look back. Not at the passengers. Not at the men who had apologized. Not at the moment itself. Because for him, it was never about holding on to anything, neither the insults nor the praise. It was simply about being who he was. And for those men? They stood there for a moment longer before finally moving forward. But something had changed. This wasn't just another flight anymore. It was a lesson. A real one. One they hadn't expected to learn, but one they would carry with them long after they left that plane. Because sometimes, the biggest regrets in life don't come from missed opportunities or lost chances. They come from the moments when we judge others too quickly. From the times we treat someone unfairly, simply because we think we know who they are. And the truth is, kindness doesn't require recognition. Respect shouldn't depend on status. And character is revealed most clearly when no one thinks it matters. That day, high above the clouds, a few men learned something they would never forget. Not because they met a famous actor, but because they were reminded how to be better human beings.